I wanted to do an update on China. So let's talk about why we're seeing tensions escalate between the United States and China and what's likely to happen under a Biden administration. So this week, the Trump administration withdrew, or at least announced that it plans to withdraw troops from both Afghanistan and Iraq, two wars that the United States has been involved in for decades.
CBS News has learned that the Pentagon expects the president to order a withdrawal of about 2,000 American forces in Afghanistan and 500 in Iraq by mid-January. That would leave about 2,500 U.S. troops in each country. Acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller said in a message to employees last night that he wants to bring the current war to an end in a responsible manner. The key word there is responsible.
The key word there is we want to keep the troops there as long as humanly possible because defense contractors make money that way. That's my decode in this segment. But he's not the only one. Miller's not the only one. The reactions to Trump's move were exactly what you would expect from some of the more hawkish members of Congress. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is just one example.
And the president is already getting pushback from his own party, including Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who said a rapid withdrawal would hurt our allies and delight the people who wish us harm. Military officials worry leaving too few troops in Afghanistan could lead to more violence in the region.
The United States and its involvement in the region has led to more violence. So we already know that spreading democracy or doing something about human rights or keeping the peace is not ever really the State Department's goal. It's what they tell the American people in order to sell these wars, in order to manufacture consent among the American people. But in reality, the truth is, it's all about the Benjamins. It's all about making money, and it's all about ensuring that these defense contractors who spend millions and millions of dollars every year in lobbying get what they want with perpetual wars. Now, some defense contractors, though, are ahead of the game. And what they're focusing on is maybe different region, maybe another opportunity to make some money, maybe ratchet up tensions and ratchet up war rhetoric with China. That could work out. And so when I saw this tweet from Li Fang, I immediately thought about China. CEO of defense contracting giant Leidos to investors regarding Trump's withdrawal of troops. And of course, we're talking about troops being taken out of Iraq and Afghanistan. If it quiets down in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's going to get hot someplace else, China. Or, of course, Asia. And unfortunately, history has told us is that there's always a place to deploy troops. So, defense contractors have been working with think tanks for quite some time now in an effort to pivot to Asia. And we saw the beginning of that during the Obama administration, which I'll get to in just a second. But some of you might be asking, like, hey, Anna, it seems like you're focusing on China based on no evidence. Like, no one here has mentioned China yet, except for this. In the context of the story regarding Trump pulling troops out of the Middle East, we got a quote from Senator Josh Hawley, and here's what he said. Americans deserve to see their tax dollars actually being used to defend them from Chinese domination above all, or, reinvested at home in their families and communities. I guess I'll add that too. Okay, so let's talk about China, because while we're focusing on the fact that Donald Trump is refusing to concede, which is worth focusing on, behind the scenes, tensions are certainly escalating. And the truth of the matter is, it has nothing to do with political ideology. It has nothing to do with Democrats. It has nothing to do with Republicans. It has everything to do with a very unique system of legalized bribery that allows not only defense contractors, but foreign countries to fund an extensive lobbying effort to militarize countries in that region. And so let me share some info about what came out this week in regard to a recent report. So just this week, the U.S. Department's Office of Policy Planning released what they referred to as a blueprint for America's response to China's rise as a superpower. The unclassified paper, Axios writes, called The Elements of the China Challenge, draws inspiration from an influential article published in 1947 by the policy planning team's founder, U.S. diplomat George Kennan, in which he introduced the idea of containment as a strategy to deal with the Soviet Union. So you can already see the parallels to the Cold War, which is why if you read anything about current tensions with China, it's commonly referred to as the new Cold War. And so here's what the report argues that the United States and its allies need to do. Meeting the China challenge requires the United States to return to the fundamentals. The U.S. must fashion sturdy policies that stand above bureaucratic squabbles and interagency turf battles and transcend short-term election cycles. The United States' overarching aim should be to secure freedom. So already we're hearing the same type of rhetoric, the same type of jargon that's used to rally support for wars abroad, right? The playbook is similar to what we've seen before with the federal government, when the federal government tries to drum up support for intervention in other countries. So it's no surprise that the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who couldn't care less about human rights, just based on the way people are being treated here in the United States and at the border, by the way, delivers speeches that sound like this.
We opened our arms to Chinese citizens only to see the Chinese Communist Party exploit our free and open society. China sent propagandists into our press conferences, our research centers, our high schools, our colleges, and even into our PTA meetings. We marginalized our friends in Taiwan, which later blossomed into a vigorous democracy. We gave the Chinese Communist Party and the regime itself special economic treatment, only to see the CCP insist on silence over its human rights abuses.
Oh yeah. I'm sure Pompeo is very concerned about human rights abuses in China. And look, we need to be honest about the situation on the ground. We need to be honest about these manufactured tensions that are brewing right now. And I'll tell you why they're manufactured in just a second. But we on the left also have to be real about human rights abuses that do take place in China. That doesn't mean that you engage in a hostile way. It doesn't mean that you engage militarily, but you have to acknowledge, with the Uyghur Muslims being detained in these re-education camps, it is a problem. But that is not what Mike Pompeo is concerned about, not in the slightest. And so that same report that I was referring to that was released by the State Department also says that, maybe we need to maintain the world's strongest military. That needs to be a priority. Strengthening our alliance system and creating new international organizations to promote democracy and human rights. Those international organizations typically will pretend to value those very things, democracy and human rights. But typically speaking, that's not what's going on. It's usually based on economic interests, self-interests, educating Americans about the China challenge, meaning propaganda, train a new generation of public servants who understand great power competition with China, reforming the U.S. education system to help students understand the responsibility of citizenship in a complex information age, meaning don't pay attention to anything that questions these manufactured tensions with China. And finally, championing the principles of freedom in a word and in deed. So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward a little bit and talk about how, not just how, but why I keep saying that these tensions are manufactured to an extent. Now, China is kicking our asses technologically. Silicon Valley is certainly concerned about the competition that China poses. So that's very real. But what isn't real is China allegedly being some sort of hostile threat to the United States. And based on the way that we've heard members of the Trump administration talk about China, you would think that they pose an imminent threat to the United States, and they don't. But the real pivot to Asia didn't start under Trump. It started under Barack Obama. And the influencing factor here was this think tank that unfortunately Steve Bannon has given an important role to in the State Department. So the think tank I'm referring to is Project 2049, Project 2049 Institute. And this think tank, since launching in 2008, has released reports arguing for a harder diplomatic approach toward China and increased military sales to East Asian states with which China has geopolitical disputes. Reports published by Project 2049 argue for selling more U.S. weapons to Taiwan and to Japan, warn about China's military capabilities, and criticize China's human rights record. So I think you can already connect the dots. There is an effort here to sell weapons to other countries under this guise of China is a threat, you need to protect yourselves. So militarize, 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 buy weapons from these defense contractors. So who is this think tank funded by? The site lists among its funders several major defense contractors such as Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, as well as branches of East Asian governments such as the Embassy of Japan and the Taiwan Ministry of Defense. Now, before leaving Trump's White House, Steve Bannon, one of his top advisors, said this. This is what he uttered at the time. I'm changing out people at East Asian Defense. I'm getting hawks in. And that he did. In fact, here's the square-jawed China hawk he was talking about. His name is Randall Shriver. Okay. And he's also the founder of Project 2049. Okay. So he now has an important role within the defense, within the State Department. He's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. So the bulk of U.S. tensions with China have been manufactured by think tanks like Project 2049 that, again, rely on funding from defense contractors who want to sell weapons. And one of the easiest ways for them to do that is, again, to sell weapons to countries like Japan, like India, again, under this guise of, well, China is a threat to them. So they need to arm up as much as humanly possible. So researchers Holly Zhang and Cassandra Stimpson looked a little closer at how money flows into these think tanks and how that cash influences U.S. foreign policy. And it's really important to understand this. So they gave specific examples. And one of those specific examples is the Carnegie Endowment Study. And they did this one study called Bolstering the Alliance Amid China's Military Resurgence, and it's filled with warnings about China's growing military power. Never mind that in 2019, the United States spent nearly triple what China did on its military. Like so many similarly funded projects inside the Beltway, this one recommended further growth in military cooperation between the United States and Japan. Important as well, it claimed was developing the capability to wage combined multi-domain joint operations, which would require accelerating operational response times to enhance power. All of this mumbo jumbo is, let's militarize the region. That's it. That's all it is. It's very simple to understand. Now, okay, how is the Carnegie Foundation funded? Like, who funded this study? The Carnegie Foundation has taken in at least $825,000 from Japan and approximately the same amount from defense contractors and U.S. government sources over the past 6 years. Carnegie's recommendations recently came to fruition when the Trump administration announced the second largest sale of U.S. weaponry to Japan, worth more than $23 billion. It's unbelievable. And when you take a step back and you look at the bigger picture, when you look at, just how much money we're talking about and how that translates into influence, how that translates into foreign policy toward not just Asia, but the Middle East, everything that we get involved in internationally. You understand the scope of this corruption, of this bribery, of this influence of foreign money. And here's a little bit more from the report that I was referring to. So the top 50 think tanks have received more than $1 billion from the U.S. government and defense contractors over the last 6 years. Such contractors alone lobby Congress to the tune of more than $20 million each election cycle. And then you got to think about that foreign money as well. Combine such sums with Japanese funding, not to speak of the money spent by other governments that desire policy influence in Washington. And you have a confluence of interest that propels US military expenditures and the sale of weapons globally on a mind-boggling sale. Homeboys just want to sell weapons, guys. That's all this is. And in the meantime, we hear all this scary rhetoric about the, about the Chinese government, about what they're going to do with communism in the United States, just absolute madness and nonsense. And so the end result is militarizing that region, which destabilizes it. There's no question. And we have such a gross history of doing this already, and we've seen what the ramifications are. And politically speaking, though, Americans end up with two parties that are essentially identical when it comes to questions of foreign policy. If you don't believe me, all you need to do is go back to very recent history and take a look at the type of campaign ads that came from both the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign. Let's start off with the Trump campaign.
For 47 years, the D.C. elite has made one country great. Joe Biden has led the charge.
I believed in 1979 and said so, and I believe now that a rising China is a positive development.
China stole American manufacturing and hoarded our emergency stockpile.
We're not trying to slow down Chinese growth.
Now more than ever, America must stop China. And to stop China, you have to stop Joe Biden. America First Action is responsible for the content of this advertising.
So Biden's reaction to that ad was, no, I'm more hawkish on China. I promise I'm going to be even more strong on China. This is what his ad looked like.
Let's talk about President Trump, China, and the coronavirus, and how President Trump failed to hold China to account when it mattered most. Barack Obama and Joe Biden put in place extra safeguards to predict, prevent, and deal with pandemics, especially those originating in China. We kept a strong CDC presence on the ground there. We even had an American expert stationed in the Chinese Disease Control Agency to be our eyes and our ears. President Trump dismantled or diminished virtually all of it. He closed the White House Pandemic Office. He cut the number of CDC experts in China from 47 to 14. He left that key position that was our eyes and ears vacant in the months before the outbreak. In early January, after the outbreak started, the CDC wanted to get into China to get information to protect Americans. China said no, and President Trump didn't push.
So, if Biden's elected, he'll spy on China more. So, we heard all sorts of anti-China rhetoric throughout the campaign. And my guess is we're going to continue hearing this rhetoric in the Biden administration. Because again, when you look at the heart of this issue, when you look at the actual influencing factors that lead to the foreign policy decisions that both Democratic and Republican administrations make, you can see that influence is going to impact them, that money is going to impact them much the same. That's why, Obama came into office and he not only continued the Bush era foreign policy that we absolutely despise, he expanded it. He absolutely expanded it. And so when Obama comes out with his third memoir and he tries to compare Lula da Silva, who lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty, to Tammany Hall, a corrupt Democratic organization, all I can say is, let's take a look at who was funding you and who was lobbying you when you were making your decision to pivot to Asia. That's what I got for you.
Yeah. Damn. That was, yeah. I mean, it's just, it's interesting to me. I mean, I used to live in China. I lived in China for a year. I lived in Shanghai back in 2008. And so it's a fascinating country for many, many reasons. But the dynamic that we're seeing in the United States in the last several years, in which we're kind of seeing a increase in the hawkish rhetoric toward China, like a sort of the beginnings of a new Cold War with China, we're kind of in unprecedented territory because unlike the Soviet Union, the original Cold War, the United States did not need access to the Soviet Union's market. The United States was fine, just like letting the Soviet Union kind of control its own internal market. Whereas the United States ruling class absolutely needs the Chinese market. I mean, that's why you see things like, the NBA, and Hollywood would collapse without the Chinese market. Bloomberg would collapse without the Chinese market. That's why Mike Bloomberg, when he's interviewed about China, he always has nice things to say about Xi Jinping and all that stuff. So there is kind of a a divide in the ruling class in the United States with regards to China. And it really depends on, am I competing with China for technology, or do I need access to Chinese markets? I mean, that's essentially what it is, right? And you can just track that perfectly. But it does seem like the sort of China hawks are going to ultimately win that battle. And we're going to see a new Cold War with China. And it's just so disastrous because, like, say what you will about the Chinese Communist Party and the human rights abuses or whatever. I mean, not coming from an American, especially like someone like Mike Pompeo, where 500,000 people sleep on the streets in America. We have 2.3 million people in our prison system, which is just an absolutely moral abomination. The way they're treated. Like, come on, like the moralizing around human rights. Like, I couldn't have less of patience for coming from the United States. So, but really, at the end of the day, what really, really matters is that the United States and China need to cooperate if we're going to have a prayer of survival on this planet. These are the two number one polluters in the world. It's going to be like that forever. China, China as it kind of economically grows and its sort of standard of living grows, its carbon footprint is going to grow. It's still not as big as the United States in terms of carbon footprint per capita, but if there's competition between the United States and China, or worse, conflict between the United States and China, the climate change, like, no matter what we do, like, goodbye, see you later, we're toast,
Story. I love that you brought that up, because this story, it was hard to write this segment because you can go off on so many different angles or tangents in this topic, right? In like the broader umbrella of US-China relations, because there is an economic component to it that's worth exploring. And I know in one of the earlier episodes of this show, Michael Brooks did look into that, and I thought he did such a fantastic job. There's the think tank angle. There's the ramifications for the American people, of course, and that involves climate change. Of course, that's going to impact the entire world. But it's just such a layered, nuanced story, and it's so fascinating. And what drives me crazy right now is this is the future. Like, this is the future issue that we need to be pretty focused on, if you ask me. And the news cycle is just nonstop. I can't stand it. It's nonstop. Like, oh, here's a circus. Let's watch the circus. Okay, but the circus is distracting us from this major issue that's going to impact every facet of our lives, including the environment. So, yeah.
And the what you touched on, the think tank issue. I mean, it's one of the more under-discussed issues in America, on the left as well. The power that think tanks have. I mean, the history is kind of interesting. Like in the 90s, when Newt Gingrich kind of took over Congress, one of his like big kind of moves was to defund the budget of Congress, not like the budget of the United States, like the budget that Congress people get to operate. And what they did was they basically had to fire all of their policy staff, because they couldn't afford it. Like, they just, you literally just didn't have the funding to have policy people to help you write legislation. I'm sorry, but like, the Congress people aren't there writing the legislation themselves. They have staffs of people who do it. So when they reduced that budget dramatically, basically what was left for these Congress people was just comm staff. They just had PR people to like help with their image. It was like the bare minimum that they could sustain. So basically they outsourced all legislative writing to think tanks, which are funded by corporations and billionaires and foreign governments, as we see. So it's basically like opening up the U.S. government for business. Like, okay, who you got? That's why you see like all manner. I mean, the amount of Gulf money that is sloshing around D.C. think tanks is like just absolutely mind-boggling. Obviously, from all countries that want to lobby the United States for anything. Like, we focus a lot on lobbying, but we focus not enough on think tanks. Like, a decent reform that a Democratic, Congress or Senate could enact like tomorrow is to just like triple or quadruple the size of Congress's budget, so that someone like AOC or whomever can hire like a staff of people to like actually help them analyze and write legislation. I mean, this is why the work of Matt Bruning's People Policy Project is so important, is because he kind of does that role for kind of left and progressive people in government. He like helps them write legislation because he's just so prolific. But you know, it would be much better if Congress people themselves had the ability to do it. And you just see like how think tanks just basically control policy because they can write legislation. The Congress people just do not have the means to do it, and you see how pernicious that influence is. That it's basically like, all right, you know, government for sale, as you know, just another element of it in the United States. It's gross.
It's so sick.
Yeah.
And like, as I was researching this again, I couldn't help but think about Obama's accusations against Lula. And it's like, are you pretending like you're not a corrupt politician? Like, are you serious? But we'll talk about that in more detail for our
Yes,
SALT
Barack
segment.
Obama like just disgusts me on a level that like his post presidency is going to be one of the worst we've seen. But anyway.